The courtroom fell silent, every creak of a bench and shuffle of a shoe extinguished by the electrifying words that had just erupted from the grieving mother standing at the witness stand. The judge, a man whose reputation was stained with whispered allegations of corruption, sat frozen. His gavel, poised mid-air, remained still, unable to quell the chaos unraveling before him. "You think I didn't know about your secret meetings? About the money you took to bury my son's case? I have the proof right here," Clara Dawson said, holding up a stack of documents that trembled in her grasp. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The defense lawyer, who had been smirking just moments ago, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the bailiff exchanged a nervous glance with the clerk. Clara turned, her tear-streaked face scanning the room filled with reporters, onlookers, and a jury unsure if they had just become witnesses to the collapse of justice itself. The judge finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Mrs. Dawson, this is highly inappropriate. I must. Don't you dare interrupt me," Clara shouted, her voice hoarse but unyielding. "You're going to hear the truth about what happened to my son, no matter how much you've tried to silence it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and just as the judge raised his gavel to regain order, Clara took a step forward, locking eyes with him. "Tell them, Your Honor," she said, her tone a mix of fury and grief. "Tell them why you let my son's killer walk free." The gavel slammed down, but the truth had already escaped, and there was no turning back. The story had started 6 months earlier, on a cold October night in the small town of Millfield. Clara Dawson had just finished locking up the family diner when her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was her son, Ethan, a bright and ambitious 17-year-old who had dreams of becoming a lawyer. "Hey, Mom," Ethan had said cheerfully. "I'm heading home from study group. Should be there in about 20 minutes. Be careful, honey," Clara replied. "I will. Love you." That was the last time she heard his voice. An hour later, Clara received the call that shattered her world. Ethan had been found lying lifeless on the side of Ridgeway Avenue. His car had been rammed off the road, and the other driver had fled the scene. The police initially treated the case with urgency, promising to bring the perpetrator to justice. Witnesses had reported seeing a black SUV speeding away from the area, and surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed the vehicle's license plate clearly. Clara believed justice would be swift. But weeks turned into months, and progress on Ethan's case slowed to a crawl. Calls to the police went unanswered, and updates were vague at best. Clara grew suspicious when she learned the name of the prime suspect. Ryan Chandler, the son of a wealthy local businessman who had ties to several influential figures, including Judge Harris, the very man overseeing the case. Determined to get answers, Clara began her own investigation. She pored through public records, interviewed witnesses who had been ignored by the authorities, and even managed to obtain the gas station footage herself. It wasn't long before she uncovered unsettling connections between the Chandler family and Judge Harris. One night, Clara found a sealed envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a letter from an anonymous whistleblower, detailing how the judge had received bribes to delay proceedings and ultimately dismiss evidence against Ryan Chandler. Enclosed with the letter were copies of bank statements and email correspondences that left little doubt about the judge's complicity. Fueled by a mix of grief and rage, Clara decided to confront the system head-on. She filed a formal complaint with the state's Judicial Review Board, but it was clear they were reluctant to act against one of their own. Undeterred, she took her findings to the media, only to have her story buried by outlets owned by the Chandler family's business partners. Clara began to lose hope. It seemed like the forces working against her were too powerful to overcome. Then, one night, she received another anonymous tip, a recording of a private meeting between Judge Harris and Ryan Chandler's father. In the audio, they could be heard discussing how to manipulate evidence and ensure the case was dismissed. With this new evidence in hand, Clara devised a plan. She would wait for a moment in court, during one of the routine hearings that Judge Harris had been stalling for months. When the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and the jury, she would expose the corruption for all to see. On the day of the hearing, Clara sat quietly in the gallery, her heart pounding as she watched Judge Harris take his seat at the bench. Her lawyer had advised against this course of action, warning that it could backfire. But Clara was beyond caring about the consequences. She had lost everything that mattered to her. The least she could do was fight for the truth. As the proceedings dragged on, Clara waited for the perfect moment. When the defense attorney began presenting another flimsy argument to delay the case, she rose from her seat, clutching the documents and the recording. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I have evidence that this court needs to see." The courtroom buzzed with confusion as Clara walked to the front, holding up the papers for everyone to see. And then she made her accusation, shaking the foundation of the courtroom itself. As Clara stood before the judge, daring him to respond, a commotion broke out at the back of the room. A man in a dark suit pushed through the crowd, his face pale as he whispered something to the prosecutor. The prosecutor stood abruptly, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor, I believe this hearing needs to be adjourned immediately." But Clara wasn't finished. She turned to the jury, her voice cracking but resolute. "If you let him silence me, you'll never know what really happened to my son." The judge's hand trembled as he gripped his gavel. The courtroom teetered on the edge of chaos, and Clara braced herself for what would come next. The room was thick with tension. Clara's heart raced, her eyes locked on Judge Harris as he fumbled with his gavel, clearly rattled by the audacity of her outburst. She could see the beads of sweat gathering on his forehead. This is not the time or place for these allegations," the judge stammered, his voice betraying him as he tried to regain control. He had always been known for his calm demeanor, but now he looked like a man caught in a lie too large to cover up. Clara's grip on the documents tightened. She could feel the weight of the moment. This was her chance, the only chance she had to make sure her son's case wasn't buried under corruption. "No," she said, her voice ringing clear through the silence. "This is the perfect time. This is the only time." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, reporters frantically scribbling notes, their cameras clicking away. The judge's eyes flicked around the room, seeking support from the prosecutor, but the man was unusually quiet, his gaze downcast. The defense attorney stood up quickly, his face flushed. "Your Honor, I demand this court remove Mrs. Dawson from the stand immediately. These accusations are baseless and disruptive to the proceeding." Clara didn't flinch. "I have the proof, and I'll show it to everyone in this room if you let me," she said, her voice low but full of conviction. For a moment, it seemed as though the judge might back down. He glanced at the prosecutor again, who remained silent, and then at the jury, who were now shifting in their seats, exchanging looks of confusion and curiosity. Finally, with a deep, almost resigned sigh, Judge Harris slammed his gavel down. "Proceed, Mrs. Dawson," he said, though his words were more of a command than an invitation. Clara exhaled, feeling the weight of the room pressing on her. She stepped forward, not just to deliver her evidence, but to tear down the walls that had kept her son's case in the shadows for so long. From her bag, Clara pulled out the envelope that had been given to her weeks earlier, the one containing the audio recording and the financial documents. She spread the papers across the table before her, ensuring they were in clear view of the jury and the gallery. "I have here," Clara said, her voice steady, bank statements showing large sums of money transferred to Judge Harris from a numbered account, as well as email communications between him and the Chandler family. "I also have a recording of a conversation between the judge and Mr. Chandler in which they discuss how to suppress evidence in my son's case." Clara pressed play on her phone, and the courtroom fell into a deathly silence as the grainy audio filled the room. "We need to move slowly. Don't let the press get too involved, and make sure no one questions the timeline of the evidence. It's better if we just let the case fade into nothing." "Understood," a voice, distinctly Ryan Chandler's father, replied. "We can't afford to have this dragged out. I'll make sure things go smoothly. You'll get what's owed." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the room. The defense attorney's face twisted with disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The jury sat frozen, their eyes wide. For a brief moment, Clara saw the slightest shift in Judge Harris's expression, an almost imperceptible flinch. It was enough. The truth was out, and the mask had fallen. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the room buzzed with whispers. The judge cleared his throat. "Enough," he said, his voice far less steady than it had been at the start. "This court will adjourn until further notice." But Clara wasn't done. She wasn't about to let him dismiss her like this. "Not until the public hears the whole truth," she interjected. "Not until you face the consequences for what you've done." The room fell into another stunned silence. It was as if time had stopped entirely. No one moved, not even the judge. Then, just as Clara began to feel the overwhelming weight of what she had done, the courtroom doors swung open. A man in a black suit entered, his face grim and his posture stiff. It was Detective James McArter, the officer who had been assigned to Ethan's case before it had gone cold. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Detective McArter's arrival was unexpected, and his presence only deepened the mystery of what was really happening behind the scenes. "Detective," Clara's voice trembled slightly, unsure of what was happening. McArter stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, before he turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," McArter began, his voice low and serious, "I have reason to believe that the investigation into Ethan Dawson's death was tampered with. I've uncovered evidence that further supports Mrs. Dawson's claims." Clara's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough she had been hoping for, but it also opened up a new question. How far had the corruption spread? Detective McArter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a file. He opened it and handed it to the judge. "The officer originally in charge of the investigation, Officer Reed, has been working with Mr. Chandler's company for the past 5 years. I've also found records showing that Reed was in contact with Judge Harris on multiple occasions regarding the Dawson case." Clara gasped. The pieces were falling into place, one after another, like a puzzle she hadn't known how to complete. But there was still so much more to uncover. Judge Harris, now visibly sweating, stood from his seat, his gavel in his hand, but his authority was slipping. The courtroom was in chaos now. The prosecutor was whispering frantically to the judge, and the defense lawyer was pacing, muttering to himself. The judge raised his voice in a final attempt to restore order. "This hearing is adjourned," he yelled, but no one was listening. Clara could feel the weight of her next decision pressing down on her. She had started this battle, and now there was no turning back. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, staring directly at the judge. "You will not silence me again." The room fell deathly quiet once more. Clara knew she had crossed the line, and there was no going back. But what would come next? Would the judge try to save face? Or would Clara finally get the justice her son deserved? The tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point. The judge, his gavel still in hand, stood there, his face pale, eyes flickering nervously from side to side. Clara could see the sweat trickling down his neck, his earlier composure now replaced with a frantic, desperate energy. For a moment, it seemed like the entire world had stopped. The air felt thick, suffocating, as the gravity of what had just been revealed set in. Clara's heart beat loud in her ears. She had never imagined she would be the one to take down a man like Judge Harris, a man who had wielded so much power and control. But now, standing there, her hands trembling only slightly, Clara felt a strange sense of empowerment. The prosecutor, who had been silent since McArter's entrance, was the first to move. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice was low, yet it carried the weight of authority. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Harris, but his eyes were fixed on the evidence in front of him. "I believe we need to reevaluate the validity of this case. Given the new evidence, it's clear that further investigation is required, and we cannot allow this trial to continue under these circumstances." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The prosecutor was finally acknowledging the truth, but it wasn't over yet. She knew how easily things could turn back in the favor of the corrupt. Detective McArter stepped forward, his eyes meeting Clara's. "Mrs. Dawson, I don't know how deep this goes yet, but I promise you I'm going to get to the bottom of it. We've already started pulling records on Officer Reed, and there's more than enough here to reopen the case properly. We'll get justice for your son." Clara gave him a weak, grateful smile. But as much as she wanted to believe him, a nagging doubt still gnawed at her. She had seen the system fail too many times. How could she be sure that even McArter, despite his apparent sincerity, wouldn't be compromised in the end? Judge Harris took a deep breath, his hand shaking as he placed the gavel back on the desk. This is a serious matter. I will need time to review this new information, and I advise all parties to clear the courtroom immediately while I deliberate. The courtroom erupted into chatter, but Clara didn't move. She wasn't leaving. She couldn't. "You'll get no rest until this is over," she muttered under her breath. The bailiff began to clear the room, but as Clara turned toward the door, a new figure entered. This time, it wasn't a detective or lawyer. It was Ryan Chandler. Clara's stomach churned as he strode confidently into the room, his face a mask of feigned concern. He was dressed in an expensive suit, the kind that screamed money and privilege, and he carried himself with the same arrogance she had seen in him months ago. He made his way toward the judge's bench, ignoring the whispers and stares from the others in the courtroom. "Judge Harris," Ryan said smoothly, his voice dripping with false politeness, "I trust you're not allowing Mrs. Dawson to disrupt this trial further. There's no need for dramatics. I'm sure we can handle this matter in a more controlled setting, don't you think?" Clara's fists clenched at her sides. "How dare he?" "You're out of line, Mr. Chandler," Detective McArter barked, stepping between Ryan and the judge. "This isn't about your family's money or influence. This is about justice, and I'm done playing games with you and your father." Ryan smirked, clearly unfazed. "I'm only trying to ensure that things remain orderly, Detective. It's in everyone's best interest, isn't it?" But Clara wasn't listening anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the judge, who had gone pale again at the sight of Ryan. There was something in the way Judge Harris looked at Ryan, something that made Clara's stomach twist. She had known it all along. This wasn't just a corrupt judge. This was a man who was actively protecting the Chandler family. And it seemed like Ryan Chandler had more control over this courtroom than she could have ever imagined. Suddenly, Clara felt a shift in the room. A weighty silence settled over them as the judge motioned for the prosecutor to approach. "Mr. Williams," Judge Harris said, his voice thick with hesitation, "I think we need to discuss the possibility of postponing this trial indefinitely." Clara's heart sank. "What do you mean, postpone? You can't just sweep this under the rug." But before anyone could respond, Ryan turned to Clara with an almost chilling calmness. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Dawson, but your son's case was never meant to be solved. There's too much at stake, and people like you, well, they don't get to change the rules." Clara felt a hot surge of anger rush through her. "What did you just say?" she demanded. Ryan's smirk deepened. "You're out of your depth, Mrs. Dawson. It's better for you to back down before things get worse. Trust me, you don't want to make enemies of people who can ruin you." The words stung, but Clara stood taller. "You don't scare me, Chandler," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. Ryan's smile faltered, but only for a moment. Then he turned to Judge Harris. "If this case is going to be delayed further, I'll need the full support of the court. After all, we wouldn't want to risk anyone's reputation, would we?" Clara felt her blood run cold. The deal had already been made. The fix was in, but she wasn't going to back down now, not when the truth was finally within reach. She locked eyes with the judge, the prosecutor, and even Ryan Chandler. "You can't shut me up. I will fight for my son's justice until my last breath. And if I have to bring this entire court down with me, then so be it." The judge's lips parted in shock, but before he could respond, a loud crash interrupted the scene. The courtroom doors burst open, and two men rushed in, their faces grim. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized them. It was Officer Reed, the corrupt officer who had once been in charge of Ethan's case, now in handcuffs, escorted by two uniformed officers. "I have new evidence, Your Honor," one of the officers said, his voice low but commanding. "Evidence that implicates Officer Reed in the cover-up of Ethan Dawson's death." The room erupted into chaos once again. Clara could hardly believe her eyes. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. But as Reed was pushed into the stand, his eyes met Clara's. They were filled with fear and something else, something that made Clara's blood run cold. The truth was far darker than she had ever imagined. The room seemed to close in around Clara as Officer Reed was escorted to the stand, his hands shackled in front of him. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously from side to side, avoiding anyone's gaze. Clara's pulse raced. This was the man who had turned a blind eye to the evidence of her son's death, the man who had helped cover up the truth. But now, he was here, forced to face the consequences of his actions. Clara didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. The revelation of Reed's involvement in the cover-up should have been a victory, but as she locked eyes with him, she saw something that made her stomach churn, a look of absolute fear, a look that suggested there was even more he was hiding. Detective McArter stepped forward, his hand resting on the edge of the stand, his voice firm. "Officer Reed, you've been implicated in a conspiracy to obstruct justice in the case of Ethan Dawson's death. We've uncovered your communications with Judge Harris and Ryan Chandler, as well as evidence of your involvement in falsifying reports. How do you plead?" Reed opened his mouth to speak, but his voice faltered. He looked around the room, his eyes wide, sweat pouring down his face. I didn't do it," he stammered, his words barely audible. "I was just following orders." Clara felt a wave of disgust wash over her. This was the same excuse she had heard too many times from people in power, the same excuse that had allowed her son's case to be swept under the rug. But now, with everything on the line, she wasn't going to let Reed hide behind his words anymore. "You were complicit," Clara said, her voice cutting through the air. "You helped bury my son's case. You're just as guilty as Judge Harris and Ryan Chandler." Reed's face contorted in fear, his eyes shifting nervously as though looking for an escape. "No, I didn't have a choice. I didn't have a choice," he repeated, almost pleading. Clara could barely contain her anger. "You always had a choice, Reed. You chose the side of corruption, and now you have to pay for it." The courtroom was silent, the weight of Clara's words sinking in. The truth was out, but Reed wasn't finished yet. His face twisted in desperation as he turned to the judge, his voice rising in panic. "Please, Your Honor, I'll talk. I'll tell you everything, but you have to protect me. They'll come for me. You have to." But before he could finish, a loud noise erupted from the back of the room. The doors burst open once again, and another figure walked in. This time, it wasn't an officer or a lawyer. It was someone Clara hadn't expected to see, someone she never thought would show up. It was Ryan Chandler. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she saw him striding toward the front of the room, his presence like a shadow looming over the proceedings. His confident, almost smug demeanor hadn't changed, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made Clara uneasy. "What is this?" the prosecutor demanded. Ryan gave him a tight smile, completely unbothered by the growing tension. "I'm here to ensure that things are handled properly," he said smoothly, his eyes flicking from Reed to the judge. "After all, we wouldn't want any more mistakes made, would we?" Clara could feel her blood run cold. There was no mistaking it now. Ryan Chandler was deeply involved in the entire web of corruption. He was trying to take control of the situation once again, to steer things in his favor. But Clara wasn't about to let that happen. "What are you trying to do, Chandler?" she demanded, her voice rising with anger. "You think you can control everything? You think you can control me?" Ryan smirked, his gaze never leaving her. "Mrs. Dawson, you've made a very dangerous mistake. You have no idea who you're up against." Clara's eyes narrowed. She could feel the threat in his words, but she wasn't afraid. She had come too far, lost too much, to back down now. "I don't care who you think you are," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "I'll expose you, all of you, for what you are. The truth is coming out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The judge, clearly rattled by the exchange, tried to regain control. "Order! Order in the court!" But his words fell flat. The entire room was a whirlwind of chaos now, and no one was listening to him. Ryan turned to the judge, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps it's best if we take a little break, Your Honor. A chance to clear our heads." The judge hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "A recess," he declared. "We'll reconvene in an hour." As the room emptied, Clara remained rooted to the spot. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Ryan Chandler was not going to let her win without a fight, and she wasn't naive enough to think that this was the end of it. Detective McArter approached her, his expression grim. You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Dawson. But I'm going to be honest with you. Things are going to get a lot more complicated from here on out. Chandler is powerful. He's not going to give up easily. Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the door where Ryan had exited. I know, she said quietly, but I won't back down. Not now. The next hour felt like an eternity. Clara paced the hallway outside the courtroom, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the look in Ryan's eyes when he had confronted her. There was something about him, something that made her question whether she had really seen the full extent of the web of corruption she was up against. When the doors to the courtroom finally opened again, Clara took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. She walked back in, her eyes locking on the judge's bench, ready to face whatever came next. But as she took her seat, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. The defense attorney was no longer sitting at the table. Instead, Ryan Chandler was standing there, leaning over the table with a grim expression on his face. And in his hand, he was holding something that made Clara's blood run cold. It was a file, her son's case file. Your Honor, Ryan said, his voice smooth as silk. I think it's time we put an end to all of this. Clara's heart dropped. What had he done? Clara's mind raced as Ryan Chandler stood there, holding the file containing her son's case. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was doing. He wasn't just a man trying to defend his family's name anymore. He was actively manipulating the situation, controlling the narrative. The very file that had been a symbol of her son's death, of all the unanswered questions, was now in his hands, and that couldn't mean anything good. She felt her legs grow weak, but she forced herself to stay standing, her eyes locked on the file he held so casually. Ryan's smirk deepened, the look of a predator who knew he had cornered his prey. You think you're the only one who can play dirty, Mrs. Dawson, he said, his voice cold, calculating. I've been playing this game a lot longer than you have. Clara could feel her pulse quicken as the weight of his words sank in. He wasn't bluffing. She had always known that he was powerful, but now it was becoming clear that his reach was far beyond what she had imagined. The file in his hand wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was leverage, and he was prepared to use it against her. Give me the file, Chandler, Clara demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. Ryan raised an eyebrow. I'm afraid I can't do that, Mrs. Dawson. You see, I've just been reviewing it, and I found something interesting. He leaned over the table, almost taunting her. Something that might change the entire course of this case. Something that could make all of your efforts meaningless. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the ground beneath her shifting, and a cold dread washed over her. What had he found? What had he done to her son's case? Don't play games with me, Chandler, she said, forcing herself to stay calm. What's in that file? Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Judge Harris, whose eyes were flickering nervously. The judge had been unusually silent since Ryan had entered the room, and Clara couldn't help but notice the tension in his shoulders. She had seen this before. Judges like Harris were never neutral. They were always aligned with those who held the power, and it seemed like Ryan Chandler had just confirmed her worst fear. Your Honor, Ryan said smoothly, turning his attention back to the judge. I believe that this case should be dismissed. There's new evidence that implicates Mrs. Dawson's late husband, Ethan's father, in a conspiracy to cover up the truth. Clara's blood ran cold. She had barely even begun to process what Ryan had said before the implications hit her like a freight train. Her husband, Daniel, who had passed away a year before Ethan's death, was suddenly being dragged into the narrative. Your Honor, I have proof that Daniel Dawson was involved in a much larger operation, one that involved tampering with evidence, obstructing investigations, and bribing officials, Ryan continued, holding up the file for everyone to see. This file contains records of his involvement. He's the one who planted false evidence to divert attention away from his son's real cause of death. Clara's heart dropped into her stomach. The room seemed to spin as she processed what Ryan was saying. How could he do this? How could he take the memory of her husband and twist it into something so sinister? She knew Daniel had his faults, but he would never, ever have done something like that. He had loved Ethan, cared for him deeply. Your Honor, Ryan continued, his voice cold and deliberate. With this new evidence, I request that the court dismiss all charges against Officer Reed, Judge Harris, and the Chandler family, and that we move on from this case immediately. Clara could feel her world falling apart. Ryan was doing exactly what she had feared. He was spinning a web of lies, using her husband's name to discredit everything she had fought for. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but Clara couldn't focus on them. All she could see was Ryan, holding her husband's memory in his hands and tarnishing it with his lies. "Objection, Your Honor," shouted the prosecutor, jumping to his feet. "This is not evidence. It's a fabrication, a diversion." But Ryan wasn't fazed. He turned to the judge with a look of complete confidence. "I assure you, this is more than enough evidence. I'm willing to do anything to protect my family's name and legacy, Your Honor. I suggest you make the right decision." The judge hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Ryan and the prosecutor. But Clara knew that hesitation wouldn't last long. Judge Harris had already shown where his loyalties lay. "Your Honor," Clara spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion, but filled with determination. "That file is a lie. Everything in it is a fabrication. My husband would never have been involved in anything like that. This is an attempt to discredit me and cover up the truth. You cannot let him get away with this." Ryan's smirk only widened. "You don't get to tell me what's true or not, Mrs. Dawson. You're just a grieving mother clinging to false hope." Clara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him turn her husband's name into something dirty. But just as the judge opened his mouth to speak, a loud voice cut through the tension. "Enough!" Everyone turned to look, and Clara felt her heart skip a beat when she saw who had spoken. It was Detective McArter. He stepped forward, his expression grim. "I've had enough of this. I've been investigating Officer Reed and his involvement in this case for months. What Ryan Chandler is holding is a lie. I have the real evidence, and I'm prepared to show it to this court." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Could this really be happening? Was McArter finally going to take down Ryan Chandler once and for all? Without another word, McArter reached into his briefcase and pulled out a set of papers, handing them over to the judge. "These are the real records," McArter said firmly. "Not the fake ones that Chandler is trying to pass off. This is the truth, and it's going to come out whether Chandler likes it or not." Clara felt a surge of hope rising in her chest. This was it. This was the turning point. But just as she allowed herself a moment of relief, she saw something that made her heart stop. Ryan Chandler's expression had shifted. It was no longer smug. It was dark, filled with something far more dangerous. His eyes locked with Clara's, and for the first time, she saw fear in his gaze. "I don't think you realize what you're doing, Detective," Ryan said softly, his voice laced with menace. "You're making a very big mistake." Clara felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She had no idea what Ryan was threatening, but she could feel it in her bones. It wasn't over yet. The worst was still to come. And then, the lights in the courtroom flickered. Clara's heart skipped a beat as a cold shiver ran down her spine. What was happening now? Before anyone could react, the doors to the courtroom slammed open with a deafening bang, and a figure in dark clothing rushed in. Clara froze. She recognized the figure instantly. It was a man she thought she would never see again. It was her late husband's business partner, and his return was about to change everything. The room went silent as the man strode in, his face partially obscured by the brim of a dark hat. Clara's breath hitched, her chest tightening as the memories came flooding back. She hadn't seen Jonathan Pierce, her late husband's business partner, since Daniel's funeral. Jonathan had always been an enigmatic figure, someone who existed on the edges of their lives. He rarely visited, but when he did, his presence was commanding. He and Daniel had shared a bond Clara never fully understood, relationship built on years of work and secrecy. And now, seeing him again, unannounced and uninvited, sent a ripple of unease through her. Judge Harris's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Pierce, this is highly irregular. You have no standing in this courtroom." Jonathan ignored him, walking directly toward the judge's bench. The air in the room grew heavier with each step. He stopped just short of the bench, his dark eyes scanning the room before landing on Clara. "Clara," he said, his voice deep and calm. "It's been a while." Clara couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She wasn't sure if she felt relief, fear, or anger. Why was he here? What could he possibly want now? Ryan Chandler shifted uncomfortably, his confident smirk faltering for the first time. "What are you doing here, Pierce?" he demanded, his tone less assured than before. Jonathan turned to Ryan, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I could ask you the same question, Chandler, but I think we both know the answer to that." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You have no authority here." "Oh, but I do," Jonathan replied smoothly, reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed it on the judge's bench. "Your Honor, this contains documents that will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt who orchestrated the cover-up of Ethan Dawson's death. And let me assure you, it doesn't point to Daniel Dawson." The courtroom erupted into whispers. Clara's heart pounded as she stared at the envelope. Could it really hold the answer she had been searching for? Judge Harris hesitated, his hand hovering over the envelope as though touching it would burn him. "Mr. Pierce, I'm warning you. If this is another disruption, I will have you removed from this courtroom." "By all means, remove me," Jonathan said, leaning back slightly. "But first, open the envelope. I think you'll find its contents enlightening." Clara's eyes darted to Ryan, who now looked genuinely unsettled. His usual composure was cracking, and the tension in his body was visible. He didn't know what was in that envelope, and that made him dangerous. The judge finally opened the envelope, his fingers trembling as he pulled out a stack of papers. His eyes scanned the first page and then the second. With each line he read, his face grew paler. This can't be true," Judge Harris muttered, his voice barely audible. Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. "It is true, Your Honor. Every word. That envelope contains financial records, email exchanges, and even witness statements that link Ryan Chandler and his father directly to the tampering of evidence in Ethan Dawson's case. And that's just the beginning." Clara felt a surge of hope rise in her chest. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning in her favor. Ryan, however, wasn't giving up without a fight. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "Pierce is lying. He's trying to frame me to cover for Dawson's family." Jonathan's gaze remained steady. "Do you really want to test me, Chandler? Because I've got more than enough to bury you and your father. The question is, how far are you willing to take this?" Ryan's face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't scare me," he spat. "No." Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "Then why are you sweating?" The courtroom broke into murmurs again, but Clara couldn't focus on the noise. Her eyes were on Ryan, watching as his confidence crumbled. She could see the fear in his eyes now, the realization that he was losing control. The judge cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Mr. Chandler, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations?" Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he turned to his lawyer, who looked equally flustered. Before anyone could speak, Jonathan stepped forward again. "Your Honor, if I may, there's one more piece of evidence I'd like to present." The judge hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Proceed." Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. This contains a recording of a private conversation between Ryan Chandler and Officer Reed. In it, they discuss how to manipulate evidence and ensure Ethan Dawson's case never goes to trial. The tension in the room was palpable as Jonathan handed the USB drive to the bailiff. The judge gestured for it to be played, and moments later, the courtroom was filled with the sound of Ryan's voice. "I don't care what you have to do, Reed. Just make sure the evidence disappears. My father's reputation is at stake, and I'm not going to let some kid's death ruin us." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to the recording. This was it, the proof she had been fighting for. Ryan's face was ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked to Judge Harris, then to his lawyer, but no one came to his defense. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice firm. "Given this new evidence, I have no choice but to reopen Ethan Dawson's case. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the conduct of all parties involved, including Mr. Chandler and Officer Reed." The courtroom erupted into chaos. reporters scrambling to document the moment, lawyers shouting over one another. Clara stood frozen, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, anger, and disbelief. But just as she allowed herself to breathe, Jonathan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over yet, Clara," he said quietly. "There's more to this story than you realize." Before she could respond, the courtroom doors burst open again, and two uniformed officers rushed in, their faces grave. "Your Honor," one of them said, "we have a situation. The Chandler estate has just been raided, and we've found something that changes everything." Clara's stomach dropped. "What now?" The officer hesitated, then looked directly at her. "Mrs. Dawson, we've recovered a recording that implicates your husband, Daniel, in dealings with the Chandlers." The room spun. Clara could barely process the words. What had they found? What did it mean? The wall seemed to close in as the officer approached, holding another USB drive in his hand. "You want to hear this?" Clara's legs wobbled, and she had to grip the edge of the bench to steady herself. The words replayed in her mind. Your husband, Daniel, was implicated. The officer's tone had been calm, but the impact of those words shook her to her core. Jonathan Pierce's face was unreadable, his eyes darting between the USB drive and Clara. Ryan Chandler, now pale and visibly shaken, seized on the moment of confusion. "See?" Ryan blurted out, his voice cracking. "I told you she's no saint, and neither was her husband. The Dawson family is as guilty as anyone else." "Sit down, Mr. Chandler," Judge Harris barked, slamming his gavel. His voice was shaky, and Clara wasn't sure if it was from anger or fear. Ryan glared at the judge, but reluctantly sat down, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. Clara, still reeling, turned toward the officer who had brought in the new evidence. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising with both anger and desperation. "What does this have to do with my husband?" The officer looked at her with a mix of sympathy and unease. "Ma'am, we found a recording during the raid on the Chandler estate. It appears to be from a private conversation between Daniel Dawson and Ryan Chandler's father. I think it's best if you hear it for yourself." Clara's stomach churned. She didn't want to hear it. She wanted to believe this was another lie, another attempt to smear her husband's name. But deep down, she knew she couldn't turn away. She had to face whatever truth was waiting for her. The officer handed the USB drive to the bailiff, who inserted it into the courtroom's audio system. The speakers crackled, and then a familiar voice filled the room. It was Daniel. "I know what you're asking me to do, but this is going too far. I can't keep covering for you, Chandler. If this gets out, it'll ruin my family." Clara's breath hitched. It was unmistakably her husband's voice, but he sounded different. There was a weight to his words, a tension she had never heard before. Another voice responded, deep and smooth. It was Ryan's father, Richard Chandler. "You've been part of this for years, Daniel. Don't act like you're above it now. We've all done things we're not proud of, but if you turn on me, I'll make sure your family pays the price. Do you understand?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. What was this? What was Daniel involved in? The recording continued. "You don't scare me, Richard," Daniel said, though his voice wavered. "But I'm done. After this, I'm walking away. I won't let you drag me any deeper." "You're already as deep as it gets, Daniel," Richard replied coldly. "And if you walk away, you'll regret it." The recording ended abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Clara's head spun as she tried to process what she had just heard. Ryan Chandler seized the moment, standing up and pointing at Clara. "You see? Her husband was working with my father. They were in this together from the start." "Shut up," Clara snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "You don't get to twist this. My husband may have made mistakes, but he didn't kill our son. That was your family." Ryan's smirk faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Detective McArter stepped forward, cutting through the tension. "Mrs. Dawson," he said gently, "I know this is a lot to take in, but I need you to stay focused. This recording doesn't change what Ryan Chandler and Judge Harris did to cover up Ethan's death. If anything, it shows just how far their corruption goes." Clara nodded slowly, though her mind was still racing. She wanted to believe McArter, but the revelation about Daniel had shaken her to her core. She couldn't help but wonder, had she been blind to her husband's secrets all along? Judge Harris, looking visibly rattled, leaned forward. Detective McArter, do you have any further evidence to present? McArter hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We've recovered additional files from the Chandler estate, including detailed records of bribes paid to various officials, including Judge Harris. The judge's face turned beet red. That's enough, he shouted, slamming his gavel. This court is in chaos. I'm calling for an adjournment. No, Your Honor, Clara shouted, standing up. All eyes turned to her, but she didn't care. Her voice rose with every word, filled with the fury of a mother who had lost everything. You're not running from this anymore. You're not sweeping this under the rug. My son deserves justice, and I'm not leaving this courtroom until he gets it. The room fell silent, the weight of Clara's words hanging heavy in the air. Judge Harris stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Proceed, detective, he said through gritted teeth. McArter stepped forward again, holding another file. Your Honor, this is a copy of a sworn statement from a former employee of the Chandler family. In it, they detail how Ryan Chandler personally ordered evidence to be destroyed, including the surveillance footage from the night of Ethan Dawson's death. The courtroom erupted into murmurs again, but Clara barely heard them. Her focus was on Ryan, who now looked like a cornered animal. This is a witch hunt, Ryan shouted, his voice cracking. You can't pin this on me. You have no proof. McArter smiled faintly. Oh, we have proof, he said. And if you want to keep denying it, I'd be happy to bring in the employee to testify. Ryan's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Clara felt a flicker of satisfaction as she watched him squirm. For the first time, she felt like justice was within reach. But just as she allowed herself a moment of hope, the doors to the courtroom burst open once again. This time, it was a man in a police uniform, his face pale and his breathing heavy. He rushed to McArter's side and whispered something in his ear. McArter's expression darkened instantly. What is it? Clara asked, dread creeping into her voice. McArter turned to her, his face grim. We've just received word that Richard Chandler has fled the country. Clara's heart sank. The mastermind behind it all was slipping through their fingers, and she had no idea what it would mean for the fight ahead. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the news of Richard Chandler's escape settled over them like a storm cloud. Clara stared at Detective McArter, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. The man who had orchestrated so much pain and corruption was now out of reach. How could you let this happen? Ryan Chandler shouted, his composure cracking. He pointed at McArter, his voice rising with panic. You're supposed to be in control, aren't you? What kind of detective lets their main suspect just disappear? McArter ignored him, his jaw tight as he addressed the officer who had delivered the news. When was the last time anyone saw him? Early this morning, the officer replied. He boarded a private jet headed for a non-extradition country. We're trying to confirm his exact destination now, but it looks like he had this plan for weeks. Clara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Of course Richard had planned his escape. Men like him didn't leave loose ends. He had known the walls were closing in and had made sure he wouldn't be here to face the consequences. Ryan, however, looked far less assured. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the defense table. Clara could see the fear in his eyes now, the realization that without his father to protect him, he was alone. This doesn't change anything, McArter said firmly, turning to the judge. We still have ample evidence against Ryan Chandler and Judge Harris, and we're prepared to move forward with charges. Judge Harris looked like he might faint. His face was ghostly white, and his hands shook as he reached for his gavel. I need time to review this new information, he stammered. This court is adjourned until further notice. No, Clara shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. You don't get to adjourn this. Not after everything that's come out today. The world needs to see the truth. My son's life mattered, and I won't let you sweep this under the rug." The judge froze, his gavel hovering in the air. Clara could see the conflict in his eyes, the desperation of a man trying to hold onto the last shreds of his power. But she also saw something else: fear. Before the judge could respond, Jonathan Pierce stepped forward. His voice was calm but commanding, cutting through the noise like a knife. "Your Honor," Jonathan said, his eyes fixed on the judge, "if you adjourn this court, you'll only be delaying the inevitable. The evidence against you and the Chandlers is overwhelming, and the public is watching. Do you really want to add obstruction of justice to your list of crimes?" The judge's hand trembled, his face turning an even deeper shade of red. He looked at Ryan, then at the prosecutor, and finally at Clara. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue. But then, with a heavy sigh, he lowered his gavel. "This court will reconvene after a recess," he said, his voice weak. "We will proceed with the presentation of evidence." The room erupted into murmurs, but Clara barely heard them. She felt a flicker of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. As the courtroom began to clear, Detective McArter approached Clara, his expression grim. "Mrs. Dawson, we need to talk," he said quietly. Clara nodded, following him into a side room away from the prying eyes of reporters and spectators. Jonathan joined them, his presence steady and reassuring. "What's going on?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. McArter hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "Clara, I need you to prepare yourself. The fact that Richard Chandler fled means we're dealing with something bigger than just your son's case. There's a network of corruption here. Judges, officers, politicians. Taking them down isn't going to be easy." "I don't care how big it is," Clara said, her voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to get justice for Ethan." McArter nodded, though his expression remained somber. "I believe you, but there's something else you need to know." He glanced at Jonathan, who gave a slight nod, then continued. "The recording we recovered at the Chandler estate. There's more to it than what we played in court." Clara's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" McArter took a deep breath, his eyes filled with regret. "There's a second conversation on the tape. It's between your husband and Richard Chandler, but it's different. In it, Daniel acknowledges that he knew the Chandlers were covering up a crime, but he doesn't name names. He says he was pressured into silence to protect you and Ethan." Clara's knees nearly gave out. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not true. Daniel wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have stayed silent." "Clara," Jonathan said gently, "whatever mistakes Daniel made, you need to remember why he did it. He was protecting his family. That doesn't make it right, but it doesn't erase the good man he was." Clara felt tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She didn't have time to break down, not now. "What does this mean for Ethan's case?" she asked, her voice trembling. McArter hesitated, then said, "It complicates things, but it doesn't change the fact that Ethan was murdered and the Chandlers were involved. We're going to keep fighting, Clara, but you need to be ready for the truth, for what comes next. This isn't over." Clara nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Just as they were about to leave the room, Jonathan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Clara asked. Jonathan looked up, his face grim. "It's a message from one of my contacts. They found something else at the Chandler estate." "What?" Jonathan hesitated, then said, "A document. It's a contract signed by your husband, and it connects him to something even." Clara's heart stopped. She could barely get the words out. "What does it say?" Jonathan met her gaze, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "It's tied to a company involved in illegal activities, money laundering, trafficking, and worse. Clara, it's not just about Ethan anymore. This goes deeper than we ever imagined." The weight of his words hit her like a tidal wave. Her fight for justice had just spiraled into something far darker and more dangerous than she could have ever anticipated. Clara felt the air leave her lungs as Jonathan's words sank in. The room seemed to tilt, her world unraveling thread by thread. She clutched the edge of the table for support, her mind racing with questions and fears she wasn't ready to confront. "What do you mean, worse?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Jonathan hesitated, his usually steady demeanor faltering. The document ties your husband, Daniel, to a shell company owned by the Chandlers. It was used to funnel money from illegal activities, trafficking, bribery, and laundering. I don't know how much he knew, but his name is on the contract as a co-signatory. Clara shook her head, refusing to believe it. No, that's not possible. Daniel hated everything the Chandlers stood for. He wouldn't have been part of something like this. McArter stepped in, his voice calm but firm. Clara, it's possible he didn't have a choice. The Chandlers have a way of coercing people. They could have blackmailed him, threatened you or Ethan. We've seen this pattern before. But why didn't he tell me? Clara whispered, her voice breaking. Why would he keep this from me? Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice softer now. Because he was trying to protect you. Sometimes, people think the only way to shield their loved ones is to carry the burden alone. It's not right, but it's human. Clara's fists clenched as anger mixed with her grief. She didn't know who she was angrier at, Daniel for keeping secrets or the Chandlers for forcing him into a corner. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. What happens now? She asked, looking at McArter. He sighed heavily. We need to corroborate everything. If this document is real, it could blow the entire Chandler network wide open. But it also means they'll fight back harder. They won't just let us dismantle their empire without a fight. And Ryan? Clara asked, her gaze flicking toward the courtroom doors. He's cornered, McArter said. His father's escape and these new revelations have left him exposed. He's dangerous because he's desperate, but that also makes him sloppy. If we keep the pressure on, we can break him. Clara nodded, steeling herself. She had come too far to back down now. As they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters whispered among themselves, cameras clicked, and the spectators were on edge. Clara felt the weight of every gaze as she took her seat. Ryan Chandler sat at the defense table, his composure barely holding. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear, but Ryan ignored him, his eyes fixed on Clara with a hatred that made her skin crawl. Judge Harris returned to the bench, his face a mask of forced neutrality. This court is now back in session, he announced, his voice tight. Detective McArter rose, holding a new set of documents. Your Honor, before the recess, we presented evidence implicating Ryan Chandler and Judge Harris in the obstruction of justice in Ethan Dawson's case. Since then, we have recovered additional evidence from the Chandler estate that expands the scope of their crimes. Ryan slammed his fist on the table, his composure snapping. This is a circus, he shouted. You're all trying to frame me because my father isn't here to defend himself. Sit down, Mr. Chandler, the judge barked, though his voice lacked authority. But Ryan wasn't done. He stood, pointing a finger at Clara. This is her fault. She's dragging my family through the mud because she can't accept the truth about her son or her husband. Clara stood, her voice steady despite the fire in her eyes. The truth? You wouldn't know the truth if it hit you in the face. My son is dead because of your family. And no matter how hard you try to twist the narrative, you can't escape that fact. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Judge Harris banged his gavel furiously. Order! I will have order in this court. McArter seized the moment, stepping forward with the documents. Your Honor, these records show direct transactions from the Chandler family's accounts to Judge Harris and Officer Reed, as well as payments to several shell companies tied to illegal activities. One of those companies, as we've just learned, was co-signed by Daniel Dawson. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on everyone present. Judge Harris paled, his gavel shaking in his hand. Detective, are you saying? Yes, McArter said firmly. This is bigger than Ethan Dawson's case. This is a network of corruption spanning years, involving multiple parties. And we're just scratching the surface. Ryan's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, I move to dismiss these proceedings on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct. This has turned into a witch hunt against my client and his family. Judge Harris hesitated, clearly torn. But before he could speak, Jonathan Pierce stood. Your Honor, Jonathan said, his voice calm but commanding. If this case is dismissed, the public will demand answers. Every person in this room knows the Chandlers are guilty, and no amount of legal maneuvering will change that. The judge looked around the room, his gaze falling on the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. He knew Jonathan was right. "This court will proceed," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the murmurs. Ryan's face turned red with fury. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something Clara couldn't hear. Then, without warning, he stood again, his eyes wild. "You think you've won?" Ryan spat, glaring at Clara. "This isn't over. My family's name will survive this, and you'll regret ever coming after us. Threatening a witness in open court, Mr. Chandler?" McArter said, his tone sharp. "That's bold even for you." But Ryan wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "You think you know everything, don't you? Well, let me show you just how much you don't know." He unfolded the paper and held it up, his hands trembling with rage. "This is a letter from Daniel Dawson to my father. He wasn't the man you think he was, Clara. He was just like us." The courtroom gasped, and Clara's heart sank as Ryan handed the letter to the bailiff. McArter stepped forward, intercepting the paper and scanning it quickly. His expression darkened as he read. "What does it say?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. McArter hesitated, then looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "It's a letter from Daniel, agreeing to help the Chandlers in exchange for their protection. He mentions you and Ethan by name." The words hit Clara like a sledgehammer. Her legs buckled, and she sank back in her seat, her mind reeling. Ryan's smirk returned, though it was weaker now, more desperate. "See? Your perfect husband wasn't so perfect after all." But before Clara could respond, the doors to the courtroom burst open once again. This time, a young woman entered, her face pale but determined. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice steady. Everyone turned to look at her, and Clara's breath caught as she realized who it was. It was Ethan's best friend, Sarah, a girl who had been silent since the day of his death. The room fell silent as Sarah stepped into the courtroom, her presence commanding attention despite her small frame. She clutched a stack of papers in her hands, her eyes darting nervously around the room before landing on Clara. "Sarah," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She hadn't seen the girl since Ethan's funeral, and now, seeing her here brought a fresh wave of emotion. Sarah nodded slightly, then turned to Judge Harris. "Your Honor, I have evidence that I believe will bring clarity to this case." Judge Harris looked flustered, but the mounting pressure in the room forced him to nod. "Proceed," he said, gesturing for her to step forward. Sarah walked to the front of the room, her steps steady despite the weight of the moment. She handed the papers to Detective McArter, who scanned them quickly, his expression shifting from surprise to grim determination. "What is it?" Clara asked, unable to contain her anxiety. McArter turned to face the court. "Your Honor, these are text messages and emails exchanged between Ethan Dawson and Ryan Chandler in the weeks leading up to Ethan's death. They paint a clear picture of what really happened." Clara's heart raced as McArter began to read aloud. "Ethan, you need to stop what you're doing, Ryan. It's wrong, and people are getting hurt. Ryan, you don't know what you're talking about. Stay out of it, or you'll regret it. Ethan, if you don't stop, I'll go to the police. I have proof." The room erupted into gasps, but McArter wasn't finished. He held up a final printed message. "Ryan, if you say anything, it'll be the last thing you ever do." Clara felt her knees weaken as the truth washed over her. Ethan had known. He had discovered something about the Chandlers and tried to stop it. And Ryan had silenced him. "That's not all," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "Ethan confided in me the night before he died. He told me he had gathered evidence against Ryan's family, bank transfers, recorded conversations, and more. He said he was scared but that he couldn't stay silent." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Sarah's voice cracked as she replied, "I was scared. Ryan's family is so powerful, and after what happened to Ethan, I didn't know what to do. But then I saw you fighting for justice, and I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." Ryan shot to his feet, his face twisted in anger. "This is a lie. She's lying." "Sit down, Mr. Chandler," Judge Harris snapped, his gavel slamming down. "Detective McArter, is there more evidence to corroborate these claims?" McArter nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Sarah has provided copies of the evidence Ethan gathered, and my team has been able to verify its authenticity. It directly implicates Ryan Chandler and Richard Chandler in the cover-up of Ethan's death, as well as their larger criminal activities. The courtroom erupted again, the weight of the revelation shaking everyone present. Ryan's lawyer tried to object, but his words were drowned out by the growing noise. "Order! Order in this court!" Judge Harris yelled, his voice desperate. Clara turned to Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, her own tears falling freely. "Ethan deserves justice. He was my best friend, and I couldn't let them get away with it." McArter stepped forward, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I formally request that Ryan Chandler be remanded into custody and that a warrant be issued for Richard Chandler's extradition." The judge hesitated, his face pale. He knew there was no way out now. With a shaky hand, he nodded. "Request granted. Ryan Chandler is hereby ordered into custody, and an international warrant for Richard Chandler's arrest will be issued immediately." The bailiffs moved toward Ryan, who struggled as they grabbed his arms. "You can't do this. You don't know who you're messing with," he screamed, his voice filled with panic. Clara watched as he was dragged away, her heart heavy but resolute. Justice wasn't complete. Not yet, but it was closer than it had ever been. As the courtroom began to clear, Jonathan Pierce approached Clara, his face unreadable. "You've done something incredible here today," he said quietly. "But this isn't the end. The Chandler's reach is vast, and there's still a lot of work to do." Clara nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I know, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." "For Ethan." Jonathan nodded, then turned to leave, but before he did, he paused. "One last thing, Clara. That letter Ryan waved around in court? It was a forgery. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he wasn't the man they tried to make him out to be. Remember that?" Clara felt a fresh wave of relief wash over her. She had fought for Ethan, but in a way, she had also reclaimed Daniel's legacy. As she left the courtroom, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. Clara breathed in deeply, feeling the weight on her chest lighten just a little. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in months, she felt hope. And as she walked away, she whispered to herself, "Ethan, I won't stop until justice is fully served. I promise."